Still being here. Well done. It's been fantastic so far. So we'll see what we talked about in our groups. I'll do a quick account of what we talked about, and we'll just follow the same structure as before. Our group was good. It started off, it was a bit rocky at first because we didn't quite know where we wanted to go with it. But we settled down, and we were talking about what kind of writing should martial arts studies kind of try to generate? You know, do we follow a quantitative approach, qualitative styles of writing, ethnographic, auto-ethnographic? What kinds of voices and registers and so on do we want to either encourage or invent? And we talked about problems around really important, really boring, but really important problems around legitimation. So the legitimation of the field. In order, particularly, it's all right for old farts like me, it doesn't kind of matter, I've got a job, but for younger scholars, they need to be publishing in a respectable context and public. So that the style of writing is beholden to institutional requirements, and we have to jump through institutional hoops. But I mean, so Megan, for instance, was really keen on saying, yeah, but you have fun with that. You play the system, you work the system, and you invent, and you just need to know what the obstacles. Well, don't even regard them as obstacles. Just what are the parameters and what are the possibilities. And in Britain, we have this thing called the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework. And what it is, it's meant to be a census of the quality of academic work. But what it actually is a panoptical tool to change our behaviours. It is panopticism. It fits the very definition of panopticism. So the REF, you have to publish work that is original, significant, and rigorous. And we talked about the way in which actually studies of martial arts, they have an international reach. We can produce our own senses of our own styles of rigour and so on. And we talked a lot about what's the relationship between the academic writing and other forms of writing. And I think the one really interesting idea that came out, really practical, pragmatic idea that we came up with was, why don't we do like a methods book? Like a book about how, like, the methods of martial arts studies, the methodologies of martial arts studies, and that would be a really significant kind of a contribution. But I thought better than a book, which with this you're talking like some kind of horrible hardback that it was going to go for £50, £100. We do like a methodology, a methods issue of the journal. So that's free, online, open access, and it really puts it out there. This is the kind of thing that we do, and this is the kind of ways that we can do it. And in order to kind of produce shared vocabulary, shared concepts, shared keywords, and that was the thing that I got most excited about in our discussion. There are other aspects, but I think that in terms of questions of the ways that we write social science, how do we get from the this to the that? The real issue is one of invention. We can invent this, and one of the things we need to confront is the question of a shared methodology or shared repository of methodologies and terminologies. So I'll hand over now to Daniel to go through to his discussions. Is that okay? You're half asleep there?
No, it's good. We're good. Okay, so with my group, we tried to look into these categories, so the transmission of martial knowledge, the embodied know-how, actually how to perform techniques, or to talk about perform techniques. Of course, we all know this, so it's based on oral transmission first, the classical way, demonstration, imitation, correction. However, we have historical documents that try to capture this. So we have audiovisual documents, written documents, representation in art, so monumental art, pictorial art, and so on and so on. However, we cannot take them all in the same box and make something out of it. So we were wrestling with these categories. Description, so it's an attempt on transmitting knowledge through written form. to the largest audience possible, although most of the author knew the limitation of this, and we also know the limitation of this, and it's addressed by Vacan, and we've discussed this. Inscription is an attempt on documenting a practice for mnemonic purpose or promotion purpose or whatever type of purpose, but it doesn't fulfill the goal of actually transmitting this knowledge. It's not intended as didactic. And codification is an attempt on transmitting knowledge with a cipher so that only a selected few could have access. And depending on the type of documentation you're facing, you have difficult obstacles to access this knowledge. And if we look at words, images, and tropos, then it makes us more or less clear that for the technical vocabulary in a description action, then you want to go to the less abstract vocabulary as possible. So you will use something that is of common understanding to everybody, head, fist, whatever. And if you go back to codification, then you will use specific terminologies, images, like the crane or whatever, you know this. If you're not aware of this technical vocabulary, if you're not learned into the tradition, then it makes little sense to you. However, this is the most interesting to look into it. However, it's the one where you have the less access to the actual knowledge if you're not learned to do this, or if you have not previous experience of martial arts or whatever. The didactic intent, the first one has a didactic intent, the last one as well, but only for a restricted few. And I would argue that it's difficult for inscription to say if there is a didactic intent or not. So we confronted our different point of views depending of the member of the group for their discipline. And for example, one argument was for film studies. I don't know if he's in the room. Yeah. So you were looking at Steven Seagal films, and you argue that it's inscription. But however, the way that he pictures himself, the way that he's involved into producing, he actually has a descriptive intent into do this. So it's interesting where categories are mixed here there. Okay. And for the intended audience, the first one is large, the last one is selective, and in the middle, we're not sure. So I'm not really happy about this. We couldn't always make it work depending on the different people of the group. Some of the people were sociologists, where they don't really work with their document they produce, but more with the observation and field work. But it somehow, at least it makes sense to me. So I would like just to throw this tool. I don't know if it makes sense to you. And I'm finished.
Okay, thanks to everyone who was in my group. We started with a practical exercise. I gave a drill, a two-person drill from the system that I train to the group. We built it up very in simple steps so that everybody could do it. And I tried to avoid, which was hard for me as well, I tried to avoid any martial arts language while doing it. So I didn't say like, okay, so the first attacker punches to the face or something, but it was like, okay, you take your right hand and you bring it in the front of his face, and then you don't deflect, you don't parry, but you push away with your left hand. And so we tried to build up this drill, and it worked quite well. And I asked, we did this for like 20 minutes or so until we had a couple of rounds going with that. And then I asked all the participants to please write down what you have, while you've been doing that drill, what you have been feeling, what you think that this might be good for, what is your interpretation of it. If you know something similar from your style that you've been training, what is the application, what would be the application in your style? And then finally, how would you describe it to transmit it to somebody else, if you would have to describe it in words? And what was interesting then to see when we asked, afterwards we sat down and everybody gave the answers to these questions, was how different these answers were, especially the how do you feel answer. So there was everything from it feels hostile to it feels very harmonious with my partner, from I'm totally stressed out, or this is too fast, to oh, this is very nice flow. So you got everything. Yeah. And it was also interesting to see how sometimes we tend to fall back into our martial arts perspective. So even though the drill is not that complicated, sometimes you're reluctant to do it because this is different than what I've been training. Yeah. Or one of the answers which I liked, which was very interesting, how do you feel? My body doesn't like to do that because I've been trained differently, so I don't want to do it. And also the question of functionality came up, which is a martial arts question. I think when Bo said, yeah, but couldn't you go a shorter way to enter here with when I explained what the application would be in my style? So the question came up, but isn't there a different way or another way, or I would do it differently? Yes, this is, of course. But this is the question of on the martial arts level, I think, on the object language, not on the meta language. And then we discussed further, like with what we could compare these movements, which approaches would be possible to that. And dance came up again. There was that interesting idea. Maybe we should have some dance choreographers and have a look at have them have a look at some martial artists and just describe what they see. So in your terms of expression, you as a professional in expressing movement, but not a martial artist. So how would you describe that? But then the question came up: is there anyone who is not a martial artist? Yeah. Because on the one hand, of course, you have an ingrained body reaction to combat. Everybody can fight, but then okay, you could say, but it's not a transmitted form of knowledge, as Eric pointed out in his talk. Like it has to be transmittable to be to count as martial art, and I would agree with that. But then I said, when you grow up in a culture like ours, you automatically learn martial arts because at least you learn them visually. Yeah, it's interesting when you see little kicks still now, 40 years after Bruce Lee, when you see little kids on the schoolyard and they do like karate fighting, they always do like every single. So they are already martial artists, yeah, in a like very weird way, so to say. So this then gets difficult. You will always bring your own background into it. Yeah. And then I think, and this is what I also wrote in an email to you, Paul, in one of the last weeks, probably, and I agree with that, Gita said linguistics would most likely be the paradigm to which we should look if we want to transfer from another already established discipline into martial arts studies and try to interpret movement. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And because martial arts is a transforming process, of course, yeah, I step back from the radicality of the statement that I made. In some very special cases, it might come in handy if a martial arts researcher is also a martial artist. Yeah, especially probably, and when it comes to the establishment of a certain language that draws from object language, but just to have some codes to shorten up things that is then transferred into meta language. Yeah. Gita gave the example that some terms in linguistics come from Sanskrit. Because they had these terms to describe certain linguistic constructions. And it was then taken over. And then, of course, that is useful. For example, what you could imagine, you have so many styles all over the world. You have so many styles that have variation of this combat stance and of this combat stance. Yeah? You even find it when somebody plays a rock concert. I was a friend of mine is a bass player in a rock band, and I was at a concert there, and he played his bass like this, or he played his bass like this. It was interesting to see. So he had a Senkotsu Dutch and a Nekuashi Dutch. Yeah. So instead of every time when you come to a new martial art that has something that looks like this, explaining, so he has his front leg you could say, so this is a Senkotsu Dutch like stance. Yeah, but then of course this is very, very difficult, because by acquiring or using the term from one martial art, you will piss off all the other martial arts. And it's like, why doesn't he use the Chinese word? Why doesn't he use the Filipino word? Yeah, but of course it would make it better. When you are, for some studies that we do, it probably is necessary to have a background in martial art, probably to better understand. We have that in the HEMA very often. This is always the discussion that goes on. Can we interpret these books without having some understanding of sword fighting? And I think the problem is yes and no. And we must always judge what do we gain of it, and what are the risks of it. Yeah? Because on the one hand you gain understanding, but on the other hand you also you make it impossible to see it in a neutral way, because you bring your background in there. So I think, yes, in some cases it's good, but we have to be super careful, and we must always bear in mind that afterwards, when we are finished, then with our study, we have to formulate in a way that it's communicatable to anyone. Also, I had this example before, to the dean of your faculty, to anyone who's interested in that. Yeah? And we cannot say, no, sorry, I cannot explain to you because you're not a fencer. That just doesn't work. So, yeah, I think it was everything.
You said you were going to show that the division of styles failed. Did you succeed in your failure?
Did I fail my failure, or did I succeed in my failure? That's a good question. I think in a way I succeeded in the failure when I asked for the emotional reactions. Yeah, but because there I could see who were the people who said that it feels harmonious and fluid. It were the Taiji people. Yeah, I could. Where are you guys? And it looked beautiful when they did it. It looked. Yeah, when I did it, when I explained without noticing, I have my body movement while doing it. Yeah, and they were the ones who immediately copied it or probably produced it out of themselves. Yeah? And so how does it feel for you? Oh, it feels very fluid. I feel very harmonious with my partner. Yeah, while other ones who have been trained in other systems are like, I don't want to do it. Yeah, the exercise is the same. So,
from across the grass,
yeah,
didn't want to do it.
yeah,
It was very interesting.
yeah, and there I would say this is not because of the individual psychological structure of the person, but it is because of the training that they had before. Their style spills over into this. Yeah. So, thank you very much, everyone who attended. Thank you.
Okay, so we had many points that match sixth results, because we were talking about the possibilities to reconstruct technique from records of technique. So how do we understand with our body techniques that are written down and that are not well around any longer? So we were pretty much soon we were not talking about technique anymore, but we were talking about the similarities between technique and language. So, which is also a bit like what you mentioned, and we came up with the comparison between language and technique is, or martial technique is, you have always some similarities, but many things that change. So we could say there is a sort of grammar in fighting, a sort of grammar in moving bodies in an antagonistic kind of environment, and every technique could have its application, its semantics. But you always have all these things in between. So you have something like a joke, which just works with language, but is not so easy to be explained. So we have one thing we came up with is the problem or the limits of empiricism. So you can try to recreate a lot of things, but the question is, where are the limits of what you can recreate? What is part of? I wanted to start it like, well, I wanted to show like sixth. I wanted to show that it's impossible to recreate anything, because this is my skeptical approach. So you have these manuals. You can't say very much about how they performed the technique. But in the end, we came up with, well, there are certain. Well, I think Ben Spatz would call this the affordances of human embodiment. So there are certain characteristics that are still the same, even though the bodies have changed, even though the way we are moving our bodies has changed. And we just have to get a discussion on the limits between the things that have changed and the things that are, well, basically human. So 2 arms, 2 legs, one head. But at the same time, I think we also have to think about how does technique, the practice of technique over time, change the body. My experience or my example would be weightlifting. So if you look at someone who's very good at weightlifting and you think of, well, can I do it? No, I can't, because I haven't done it for like 5 years. So I can't lift 200 pounds with one arm. So, but there may be people who can do this. And then we have to think about the interconnection between what bodies can do by themselves. Are there bodies that are not shaped by technique? No, they aren't. So it's a bit the same question, is there an universal language which every body develops? No, you develop language because you're born into some sort of communication society which communicates with you. And with technique and the way you move in combat or in situations that are likely to be combat, it's the same thing. So you're getting, you're socialized into moving your body. And these are basically the things we're thinking about without getting to an initial, an answer at the end. So thank you very much for attending in my group. And
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone like to comment, add to anything? Do you want me to? You want me just to sign you off early and we can just go to the pub? Yeah, I know you do. I know you. Look, you don't have to say this to me. I think if I turn up at work, that justifies me going home and going to the pub straight away. I made it in. I fancy a drink.
Are you happy with the workshop?
Yeah.
I'm happy with this workshop. I am happy with the workshop. I mean, in our group, we ditched Wacom pretty quick. And we just sort of, it became a much more interesting discussion about all the issues around the construction or the elaboration or the development of a field and the connecting of that to institutions and the ins and outs of that, which I think is a really, really important thing. So we moved away from that kind of pseudo-profundity of like, the guts to the intellect and the da-da-da. And we moved into, but what do we want to do? Who are we doing it for? Why do we want to do it? And we talked about community engagement. We talked about jumping through institutional hoops. So it was really, really interesting. We did talk about problems of embodiment as well, but that sort of recedes. Like, yeah, we can deal with that. Communities invent ways of communicating with each other. I think was the short version. So it's not, shit happens. So yeah, anyone else? I don't want to silence people or I mean, if we're happy, if we're good, then we can call it a day, call it two.
Another productive conference.
Yeah.
Very productive.
Yeah, I think.
Maybe you were not expecting this. You had another result in mind. What you have achieved is reproductive. Yes.
It wasn't really a question. It was more about following on from what you were saying. Where do we go next? Is that something we could talk about briefly? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing. I mean, if you look at the editorial for the latest issue of Martial Arts Studies, which we've been advertising throughout the conference. So, as Megan has said to me in private communication, it's like we've got this research field now. We've come out of the woodwork. We're going to conferences. We're publishing. We're reading each other's work. And that's one level. That's a research level. But then, what else do we want to create? Do we want to create degree courses? And if so, what do they look like? We had a really interesting panel today about martial arts studies. I think that the idea of just posing the question of methodologies is really fundamental and really interesting thing to do, because then that defines something of the uniqueness or the specific flavors of the field. And it gives it helps to invent and persuade, as we've been talking, persuade the dean, persuade the funding bodies, maybe inculcate desire, generate desire among potential students. All of these things are important. What do you think? Anyone? Oh, sorry.
You attempted to define what is martial arts studies with your monograph. You also addressed this question in several articles, and you also did a bit on methodologies. I'm not sure about writing the book of methodologies of martial arts studies would be the way. I think that maybe trying to, well, I know your opinion about interdisciplinarity or discipline, roots or anchoring. But I think that if we manage to have several good case studies that we could label as this is ideal possible martial arts studies, and we go further into how we can, I don't know, train people into do this could be a way, but more as a repository of different methods than as a single one. But
I as I said to our group, I think that for someone like me, it's really the theoretical concept that becomes the methodology, you know, and there's these really incredibly powerful concepts that organize our discourse. Like ever since 1978, we've been identifying Orientalism, you know, over and over and over again. And ever since the 70s and before, we've been identifying patriarchy, and then for a brief period of time, people were identifying phallo-logocentricity, but they got bored of that. But you know, there are theoretical concepts that structure our work, like imagined community, invented tradition, Orientalism. These are really these are productive, discursive generators, aren't they, at the minute? So I think, for me, the theory it really pushes you in it or pulls you in a direction. And I was thinking, because Sarah was saying that it's a really important stage of saying this is a thing, it's here, and this will help us to clarify what we are, what we're not, what we're for, what we're against, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and then we get better at having arguments with each other. Megan?
Far be it from me to get between the audience and more alcohol, but I think the kind of idea that Sarah was proposing, as I understood it, would not have involved the production of an authoritative, definitive statement of methodology, but rather a practical exercise in demonstrating the range of possibilities that are there. And one of the reasons I think that's a super smart idea is that if you look at the formation and the failures of attempts, I love looking at failures, that's really, really important. And if you take the precedent of cultural studies, one of the places in which it has failed spectacularly is the United States. And in terms of producing and maintaining an institutional protected space, if you like, for people that could endure waves of coming and going of political attacks. So I think one of the most interesting things that you can do if you're trying to build something is to take pleasure in planning proactive defensive measures. And the US higher education system is so complex, it would be ludicrous to suggest that you could identify one cause of the failure of cultural studies to establish itself as anything other than a personal approach. But one thing I think is really key is that in the areas of the world where we've succeeded, it's precisely because we've moved fairly early away from highly emotive, identity politics driven statements of interpretive practice and into hard stuff like producing method things, producing credible claims to a field-based template which is flexible enough for many, many people to occupy it, but which is nevertheless visible enough for somebody with the attention span of a mosquito, which is your average dean, I'm sorry, again. You can't listen for very long if you're in those positions. They have to be able to see your template, see what you do. And it's like armour. You must have the capacity to talk about method. And if you skip that stuff, then once your moment in the marketplace of being a bit cool and hot is over, or once a sort of orange pumpkin takes over your universe, you're wide open. You have nothing very strong to defend yourself with. And if you can produce, pardon me, Paul, but disciplinary claims that have credible ways of talking about access to community interests, public engagement, then you can also get support from parents and young people who feel they have been helped in life. And if you skip these other steps, then you're a sitting duck the minute someone wants to get rid of you.
Thank you. So I would like to pick up on two things. Basically something you said, Paul, and something you said, Sixt. It is about methodology. So my question is, why reinventing the wheel? Why doing something that probably already exists? And what I would, for example, take as an interesting blueprint is actually sports science. So it's a whole set, of course, of different approaches. It might be history, it might be biology, for example, if it's about competition. There might be biomechanics, for example, if it's about analyzing technique or anything. So there is, in my eyes, sort of a blueprint. So focusing a certain perspective and like approaching it through different disciplines, depending on what is actually your research focus, history, whatever. And the only thing that I see that is not actually like covered in sports science is something that Sixt actually said. So linguistics, that's something that I have not encountered so far in sports science. And it's something I think that is very specific about the martial arts studies, that we have faced here, this international conference, actually the issue of how we address in different languages, of course, concepts. And so I think language is pretty much a key to, actually understanding martial arts. That's something I repeatedly have been actually witnessing now. It is language that is the key, of course, to these concepts, in my eyes.
Daniel had a great idea. Why don't we all have a group photograph, like come down on the stage and do that? So thank you very much, everyone. It's been emotional.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.